Good morning all and welcome to the first webinar of the series from the Yorkshire region. We have 80 attendees, which is fantastic. Thank you all for joining and thank you to the RTPI for platforming this event. The webinar on nutrient neutrality will last about an hour. The main presentation will last around 40 to 50 minutes with remaining time for questions at the end. If you use the question function, I'll put them to presenter at the end of the presentation. By way of introductions, I'm Simon Johnson, Regional Board Member for the RTPI and Unit Manager for Environmental Planning at Delta Simons Environmental Consultants. I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague who will be presenting this topic, Richard Lawless, who runs our geo-environmental team in the north of England with 20 years experience in environmental consultancy, and I for one am really looking forward to this interesting topic.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. When we were suggesting a range of possible topics for the discussion, we did mention nutrient neutrality, and there was an awful lot of interest. It jumped to the head of the queue, as it were. So more than happy to discuss this today with you. So just in terms of a quick background, as we are consultants, we do have a specific and fairly subjective view and knowledge of nutrient neutrality. I'm very aware that some of the audience today, there's a mixture of regulators and also planners with local authorities, and some of you may have some more specialist knowledge or specific experience and a slightly different viewpoint, but we'll discuss the topic hopefully from a holistic point of view as we approach it as a consultant. So why are we talking about nutrient neutrality today? Well, it has certainly been in the news in the last year or so, some of it particularly regionally focused around the south of England and the Solent, but also affecting part of Herefordshire. And most recently at the weekend, there was a big article in The Guardian about the impact of nutrients on the River Wye and the sources of that. So not just the planning impact that this issue is causing, but also the environmental impact. So in terms of today's presentation, because I'm not quite sure what the audience's knowledge is of various aspects, I will start off with just a bit of background on the issue of nutrients in the environment generally. Then I'll move on to where the concept of nutrient neutrality actually comes from and why and when is it needed. I'll then move on to discuss how it's being implemented in the UK at the moment. And then finally, I'll do my best to talk about, first of all, how effective the current measures are, and also where this might be heading in the future, albeit obviously that is somewhat speculative. So nutrients in the environment. In simple terms, nutrients are a good thing normally. A lot of the world's agricultural soils are actually nutrient deficient, particularly in Africa and parts of South America. It's in places like particularly Western Europe and some other areas where historically there's been an awful lot of over application of fertilizer that has led to environmental problems. So the applications can lead to environmental releases via different media. So it's not all necessarily to watercourses. It can also go to groundwater. You can have particulate releases and airborne releases as well. And the most common environmental issue that we have to address is eutrophication, which is effectively where nutrient-hungry species take over and alter or harm the existing balance in that ecosystem. So in a terrestrial setting, which you can see on the left, often you'll get nutrient-hungry species like grasses taking over and blocking out other species. And in freshwater or marine environments, you'll get potentially algal blooms forming which block sunlight, first of all, so they will outcompete other forms of vegetation. They'll also remove oxygen from the water, particularly at night, which can ultimately lead to fish kills but also you will be looking at losses of prey species as well, and birds of prey, etc., and other things that actually then feed within that ecosystem. So and that nutrient deposition, it can be directly into the water, but also it can be airborne, and it can be a combination. And eutrophication as a UK definition, it is not a straightforward definition. It's not just the chemistry of the water that will form an initial trigger. You have initial trigger concentrations of nitrate and phosphate, but that's only potential for eutrophication. Then you will need ecological and biological evidence as well, such as on these photographs, to demonstrate that it is actually occurring and you actually have active eutrophication taking place. So we'll talk about the two main nutrients that are causing the issues in the UK. One is phosphorus, and found in the environment as phosphate. It has been declining in our environment since the 1990s. Particularly, it's been removed from fabric conditioner, and that has made a big improvement through the 1990s, albeit the concentrations in rivers are broadly stabilizing. They're not going down as fast as would be liked, and the environmental standard is very low. It is variable. It depends on the wider chemistry, is what your actual phosphorus target is in water. But a lot of levels in water still exceed the environmental standard, and it's the most common reason for freshwater rivers in England actually failing their good status. So there's a wide range of sources actually of phosphorus. It's fairly balanced between the agricultural sector, but also industry and domestic sewage. So in terms of that pie chart, it is a reasonable mixture of potential inputs. So that is phosphate. And another thing to mention is that whilst it's very much a waterborne pollutant, phosphate, it can be sorbed to soil, to sediment, and to bedrock. So it can be attenuated in the natural environment potentially. Nitrogen is actually far more complex because the whole nitrogen cycle is quite a thing to discuss really, because there's water, groundwater, air, and particulate emissions to consider, depending on which form of nitrogen we're dealing with. Because in terms of nitrogen, it's the reactive nitrogen we're really interested in, whether it's reduced, the ammonia, ammonium, or the oxidized, the nitrate. And there are different sources for each and different environmental impacts associated with each. A lot of these sources are not currently declining in the UK, so a different picture to phosphate. And in fact, if you look at the charts here showing water quality trends, in the last couple of years, they've actually been going up. Now, that may not be a significant long-term trend, but potential reasons for that I've read, one might be to do with we've had a few dry summers, which will reduce the dilution available. And also, there has been some increased land spreading of various manures close to some of these rivers, and that has had a noticeable impact as well. So nitrate is very much the predominant source of eutrophication in our estuarine and coastal waters. It's an issue in groundwater in that we get a lot of our drinking water from groundwater. We do have a human health limit for drinking water. About a third of our drinking water now needs to be blended with less contaminated sources of water to make sure that the nitrate concentration is below that limit, and that is increasing, unfortunately, as the years go by. And this is partly because the plan on the left is showing the travel time within the unsaturated zone above the groundwater table. So from release at the surface or in a farmer's field down to actually reach the groundwater table. And in some of our principal aquifers, such as the chalk, you see the dark blue colours there. That is predicted to take at least 50 years to reach the water table. So the BGS may be unhelpfully, slightly unscientifically called this the nitrate time bomb, which not necessarily helpful. It certainly grabbed the headlines. So even if we switched off the tap of all of our nitrogen sources tomorrow, we would still get in some areas an increasing load from groundwater infiltration. And groundwater, of course, is a really important source for base flow to some rivers, particularly at specific times of the year. So those will still be receiving an increasing loading of nitrate from groundwater in the decades to come. So the reactive nitrogen cycle, as I say, it's quite a complex pattern, but this figure really simply shows some of the main source activities. Combustion of fossil fuels has always been a significant source. It is reducing now from coal-fired power stations significantly, although there's still very much the issue with vehicle emissions. There's fertilizer manufacture, and there's all the agriculture and livestock uses. Effectively, you get both ammonia and nitrate. So you'll get both the gaseous phase and the liquid phase coming out of the agricultural uses. And so typically for nitrate and ammonia, we will see terrestrial eutrophication. So our upland kind of heathland habitats and so forth can be very sensitive, but also then ultimately, if it's released to water, you will get released to our estuaries, and that is causing marine eutrophication. I'll come back to this figure to see how our UK approach is affecting this nitrogen life cycle. So the legislation. Now, when I did an initial run through of this last week, the legislation section was apparently too long and boring, so I've tried to cut it down to one slide. Apologies if that oversimplifies some of the legal aspects, but I have tried to get to nutrient neutrality in 10 easy steps. So here goes. I am not going to be talking about legislation relating to nutrients on a wider basis, because there's an awful lot, and we could be here all day if I was talking about legislation that relates to nitrogen, for example, because there's so many different aspects to it. But focusing on nutrient neutrality, well, the key piece of legislation really is the habitats regulations. So step by step, first of all, it establishes really strong legal protection for our Natura 2000 sites, which they are made up of our special areas of conservation and our special protection areas. So basically birds and water habitats. So very good legal protection, first of all, for our Natura 2000 sites. Then it talks about for any plan or project in which there is any change or modification to land use in effect, then an appropriate assessment, which we know as a habitats regulations assessment, would be required if there is a likely significant effect. Now, these definitions are not clearly laid out in the legislation itself, but there have been numerous legal rulings in Europe that have really clarified. Hello, can people hear me? Sorry, I just got a notice saying that I was muted, so I shall carry on. So you have to look to the legal rulings for specific definitions and guidance on what these things mean. So plans and projects are actually very wide-ranging, and actually wider ranging than what we might consider for a planning application. Likely significant effect is actually particularly badly worded. And really, the various judgments make that clear that it simply means whether a plan or project is capable of having an effect. And they specifically use the word possible. So actually, that sounds a much lower threshold than a likely significant effect. And a plan or project should not be authorised unless it can show beyond reasonable scientific doubt that it will not adversely affect the integrity of a Natura 2000 site. And when that is added to number 6, that you have to consider the cumulative effects of other plans and projects on the same Natura 2000 site, then you can see how stringent this legislation is. So you may only be finding evidence of a limited release and limited potential impact on the Natura 2000 site. But if that is in conjunction with other impacts, that will still be unacceptable and should be rejected. So the second part of this really is the Water Framework Directive, and that is very closely intertwined anyway with the habitats regulations. But what this does is provide specific targets and goals to be achieved relating to our habitats. So EU member states are required to achieve good status in all water, groundwater bodies by 2027, with various caveats in there. Many Natura 2000 sites are covered by that requirement. For those that aren't, they themselves, so if they're not actually in the water environment, there are some that are away from specific water interactions, then they still have to reach favourable status, which is effectively the same, albeit there's no deadline. And if any Natura 2000 site is failing to achieve that good or favourable status, then very clearly no further deterioration is permissible. So if we are in a scenario where we have a Natura 2000 site that is not in a good status, that is where the concept of nutrient neutrality has come from. So if our Natura 2000 site is being impacted by nutrients, and it is pretty much the most common reason why our Natura 2000 sites are not achieving good status, and I'll show you some maps to illustrate that later, then no further deterioration is permissible. So no further release of nutrients to that receptor if that is what is causing the unfavorable status. So that's it in 10 steps. There's obviously a lot more to it than that in broader terms. There's a lot of supporting legislation, the Nitrates Directive, for example, but really that is the nub of it in terms of nutrient neutrality. So some of you may be aware that there were some legal rulings recently in the Netherlands which kind of kicked off some of the activity from 2019 that's occurred in the UK. So we have, as Delta Simons, we have a sister company in the Netherlands, and we've been discussing the impact with them on their country, and it is really hard to understate, really difficult to understate just how significant that's been. But the Netherlands as a country, about 14% of their land area is classified as a Natura 2000 site. It's a country with very high environmental sensitivity. Over 90% of their coastline is designated as a Natura 2000 site. Yet they also managed to be the world's second biggest exporter of food, only behind the USA. So they use highly intensive methods. This photograph here is it looks like a business park, but this is actually their high intensity industry, agricultural industry. It really is impressive, and unfortunately, it's leading to a huge excess of nutrients and release of those nutrients to the environment. Now, the Netherlands were very much aware of this anyway, so they have been trying to deal with it for a long period of time. This plan on the left shows just simply from airborne emissions and airborne deposition the exceedance of the annual critical load on their Natura 2000 sites, and you can see there's an awful lot that are receiving far more nitrogen than they should be. So they passed what was called the PAS regulation in 2015, which was programmatic. So it was strategic to try and deal with the issue on all kinds of development activities. So all kinds of permissions are required to undertake farming activities or development or infrastructure works, upgrades, and so forth. Now, this regulation included threshold values for nitrogen deposition. Straight away, there were legal challenges on some of the initial decisions by some of the Dutch environmental charities. And there were two particular ones. The first one was to do with 4 livestock farms, which the way the legislation was written meant that these farms did not need a permit to allow the cattle grazing and fertilizing. So they challenged that exemption. And the second one was related to a further 6 farms which did have permits to expand, and they were granted based on specific threshold values for nitrogen which they were allowed to deposit. Now, the European Court of Justice sided with the appeals on both occasions, and these decisions were confirmed in the summer of 2019, and they were incorrectly screening out sites from needing an appropriate assessment, and also the actual permits themselves that they were granting were allowing additional releases of nitrogen to these Natura 2000 sites that were in unfavourable status. And so it was acknowledged that basically the past regulation was not fit for purpose, and it has pretty much been discontinued. So the impact on the country has been quite astonishing, to be honest. I don't know how aware people are of what's been going on in the Netherlands. It has, of course, been overshadowed by the COVID-19 issues, but before then, this was the biggest story in the Netherlands. So straight away, hundreds of existing permits were cancelled. Construction work has been halted and still is broadly halted on about 18,000 projects across the country, and they estimate about 14 billion euros worth of projects are at risk. Longer term measures are being put in place and discussed at the moment. One thing to bear in mind, that all forms of nitrogen emission are affected, so it's from all sources. The initial driver for this was air emissions, but any project has effectively been put on hold, and this includes some fairly urgent things like strengthening dikes and flood protection measures. And there, it was actually the emissions caused by the construction plant. So what you might think as fairly minor emissions, but even though they were minor, they were still being emitted to the environment, and therefore they were not being allowed, or certainly not being allowed at the moment. So the government has had a two-pronged response. And in December 19, they had emergency Christmas legislation effectively. And they now have the lowest speed limit in the EU. So they dropped the speed limit. So the savings in nitrogen from that, which they described as a slither, has allowed them, with that kind of headroom that they've created, to allow some urgent projects to proceed. So they've removed the logjam slightly from some of their particularly urgent infrastructure work. They also provided a minimal nitrogen threshold, so that could still, in theory, be challenged. But they've basically tried to be pragmatic and allow, albeit a much lower threshold, to allow some projects to continue. They have straight away reduced the input of nutrients to animal feeds, a lot of which passes straight through and goes into manure and hence to the environment. And they basically created a war chest of €500 million to start buying up some of the farms that were nearest to the nature reserves, particularly pig farms. They're just buying them up and taking them out of use. So pretty drastic, but not as drastic as the longer term measures which they're hoping to bring in at the end of this year. So they are seriously talking about halving the Netherlands livestock count, which is quite shocking. They are looking to carry on purchasing, particularly the pig farms, and decommissioning them. So really kind of almost like halving the livestock side of the agricultural business over there. There are various large scale schemes that they're struggling to see how they're going to be able to permit. One good example is airport expansion. They're really going to struggle to see how they can justify it with the current legislation. Certain political parties, however, are taking a completely opposite view, and that they have had serious suggestions to simply declassify their nature reserves. That was a serious suggestion. And one or two of the political parties over there, their official response is not to change anything, is to carry on as normal, and that the economy is more important than the environment. So in May of this year, the farmers' unions walked out of the government talks on this strategy. I'm not sure if they've walked back in yet, but there are, like I say, ongoing issues. So before COVID-19 struck, this was the big issue in the Netherlands, and the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, he might have regretted saying this, but he said at the time that it was the deepest crisis he had ever dealt with in 9 years in power. Now, obviously, the definition in 2020 of crisis has probably changed somewhat for him, but this has not gone away. This is still an issue they are really desperately trying to tackle and come to terms with. So that's the Dutch context, which then brings into mind of what has happened since then in the UK. So some of you will be very familiar with this. I noticed that some of the council representatives are on the call, and there's Natural England Environment Agency, who are all grappling with this very complex subject themselves. So following the Dutch rulings, Natural England provided new legal advice to several local authorities, and there were some particular ones. So the first one focused on the Solent Maritime Natura 2000 sites, which has really captured all of those councils or part of their boroughs within that table. And they advised that basically new developments providing overnight accommodation should be nutrient neutral, and provided very similar advice to Herefordshire Council that an existing nutrient management plan to manage phosphate emissions into the River Lug, which is a tributary of the River Wye, was now non-compliant with the Habitats Directive, i.e. it needed effectively tightening up. And I've seen various numbers of kind of paused or stalled homes. This may be an exaggeration on behalf of some of the press, but certainly many thousands of homes have been stalled. Some local authorities have restarted some of the planning process, but certainly not all. And I've noticed that just last week, the NHS estates have issued a note internally that 29 of their hospital sites are affected. So where they're planning any future overnight accommodation, which is obviously critical to what they do, then they are going to have to address the issue of nutrient neutrality. They've got 29 sites in the Solent area that are affected potentially. So there's a lot of urgent ongoing work, which I will come on to, but it's just interesting to do an immediate comparison with the Netherlands situation. So the response to date appears to have been very focused on particular sectors and really just to do with the planning situation. Now, I have to acknowledge we are simply consultants. We do not see all of the inner workings of government departments and the regulators. I'm certainly aware a lot of work is being done on this topic. I obviously can't say exactly what because they are not publishing exactly where the areas of research and efforts are going, but certainly there's work going on in the background. So this has, despite this being more of a regionalised effect than the Netherlands, it's still got into Parliament, and Boris has had his say in typical Boris style. So apparently the ministerial dino rod is being employed. So if anybody's seen evidence of that, please let me know. But like I say, I'm certainly aware that DEFRA and one or two other ministries are heavily involved in trying to deal with this, because clearly there's the drive to keep the economy and keep house building and development going, meet those needs, but also we've got to protect the environment and see how those two can dovetail. So the Solent Maritime SAC, or Natura 2000 site, this is the best known case in the country. Natural England, as well as highlighting and providing the legal advice, they are working very hard on assisting with solutions, to be fair to them. They're now on their 5th iteration of the guidance on nutrient neutrality, and that's just within the space of 12 months. So there's clearly people beavering away very hard in the background. And the method to calculate the net change in total nitrogen has been produced by Natural England. So they've produced basically a nutrient balance calculator, which is very useful for a limited, fairly narrow range of scenarios. So it really is focused on this particular problem. So it's looking at what is the existing land use to see where that's being stopped, what nutrient release is that delivering, then what new nutrient releases are being introduced by the proposed development, at least in terms of going to foul sewer, and then they work out that nutrient balance. And if it's in excess, that must then be offset. And the offset must be for the lifetime of the development. And I've seen that period banded around between 80 and 125 years. So that needs to be effectively locked in. So the nutrient balance calculator is a useful tool. It's been revised already at least a couple of occasions. And it's designed really just for development that will result in an increase in overnight stays. So it's all about additional flushing of toilets, for want of a better way of describing it. It assumes that the site is served by the wastewater system, albeit there is a separate calculation you can do if the development is off grid. And it's designed really for new homes, etc. And it is not designed for any other purpose. And it simply provides that balance. So just a couple of quick examples of typical outputs. We've got a typical brownfield site on the left where, well, it's not typical in some ways, and it's only 10 residential units on 1 hectare, which normally you would have more houses on here, but just as an example, it works. And that shows that because there was no existing loss of nutrients to the ground, because it's a derelict brownfield site, you're adding 10 residential units, therefore you are going to be adding nutrients to the system. On the right, an existing agricultural site, so we assumed it was a dairy farm. And there you can demonstrate actually that you can be nitrogen neutral, or in this case, actually taking nitrogen out of the environment slightly. So straight away, you're seeing one possible problem with this whole approach, that it is going to be providing a more favorable outcome for existing agricultural or greenfield development over brownfield. So when we're looking at wider sustainability goals, this doesn't really help. So if you do have an excess of nutrients, there are some measures that can be taken. Some of these are very much works in progress, and some of these are a bit theoretical, but on site there are some limited options which can be implemented. One is to actually use a standard package sewer treatment plant. They're not particularly pretty, they're expensive, there's ongoing costs, they have a land take, and they will not remove all of the nutrients in there. So they are maybe part of a solution, but certainly not going to be effective if it's just a small development. If it's just a few houses, it's not going to be cost effective. You could increase the size of the open space provision for the development to try and make it nutrient neutral. Again, there's an obvious cost implication to doing that. You could look to add kind of wetlands reed beds to remove a proportion of both nitrogen and phosphate. Both of these can be effective, but again, they may not take all of the nutrients out of the ground. You also need additional space, so you need a lot of land. You need a big site to be able to incorporate this. So any of those solutions are all possible. They may well help towards a wider solution, but are unlikely to be sufficient on their own. So the concept of off-site offsetting has very much been discussed, and this has been a lot of the focus of the work, particularly in the Solent. Conversion of agricultural land for community and wildlife benefits. I'll come on to a specific case where that is being rolled out at the moment. Similarly, you could look at woodland planting on agricultural land. Before I get on to the next ones, one of the keys for this is to be able to demonstrate legally that will be locked in for a minimum of 80 years. So you need to find a legal mechanism for actually undertaking that. You can offset it wastewater treatment plants downstream, albeit you cannot interfere with the AMP framework. So the 5-year investment programs that the water industry goes through, they will be tackling nutrient releases generally, but that is a slower process and will not deal with the issues in the space of time that's required to unblock the planning system. A lot of work is being done on that, however, and certainly from reading some of the Environment Agency outputs, notwithstanding certain pollution incidents, the water industry is doing quite a lot in this area. But effectively, if your treatment plant downstream of your site doesn't have a tertiary treatment installed, then there effectively won't be nutrient treatment taking place. And one obvious downside of it anyway is it's not only expensive to implement, but it's expensive to run, and they're generally energy intensive processes, and so they do use a lot of power to take it out. So far more of a focus really collectively should be at removing it at source, not letting it get to the sewage treatment plants in the first place where possible. But anyway, you can provide additional mitigation that way. And then also there's other things you can look at to reduce nutrient burden. So water efficiency measures, installing SUDs at existing developments, so particularly councils where you have existing property portfolios, can you look to invest and do work there, gain nutrient credits so they can be used on permitting other schemes which are showing a surplus. So that's where we're up to. So the first offsetting scheme, which has been released to the press a few weeks ago in May. So the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust has secured 40 hectares of arable farmland. They're proposing to switch it from agricultural use to a rich wildlife haven, and therefore reducing the nitrogen contribution. Now, apparently, that will take sufficient nitrogen out of the environment to allow nitrogen credits for up to about 400 homes. So they are also planning to replicate this and potentially maybe even provide sufficient land for all 12,000 units, but we'll see how that goes. So Little Luxmore Farm, there it is on the Isle of Wight. That's how much the 40 hectares are. If you were to do it on a larger scale for 12,000, then you'd be taking quite a significant chunk of the Isle of Wight agricultural land out of operation. And if it wasn't prime agricultural land, or if it was lower intensive usage, you would need a larger area again. So from a commercial perspective, if a house builder is thinking, well, how much would it cost to buy into this? Just on a very simple metric, it cost £1 million to buy that farm. So £1 million divided by 400 properties. So as a minimum, it's going to be £2,500 per home to buy into that scheme. But the charity naturally has to transform the land. they have to manage it effectively for perpetuity, and they have to set up a legal framework to run it, and the insurance and everything else. So how much should a developer be asked to contribute to the scheme? Well, it's early days, and it will be on actual kilograms of nitrate input rather than per house, I guess. But just in terms of some figures, it could easily be double, treble of what that initial cost of £2,500 would be. But it's very early days, and I'm very interested to see what that initial cost is. But again, I suspect it would be more expensive for a brownfield development to buy into it than something that is more greenfield or more open space. So again, it's going to be more expensive for a brownfield site probably to buy into a scheme like this. So the strategy, just kind of stepping back in terms of what's going on in the Solent. Well, that housing wasn't even on this nitrogen cycle. So I've added some housing and the wastewater releases down on the bottom, and it's just dealing with leached nitrate in effect and what is ultimately ending up in our estuaries via a treatment plant. So the other significant sources of reactive nitrogen are not really part of this process currently. So everything else is missed out. Another way of looking at it is I don't have specific kind of all source impact data for the Solent Natura 2000 site, but just down the road, there's the Poole Harbour where we do have data showing impact from all the different nitrogen sources. And there, over 80% is from the agricultural sector. Sewage treatment works are only providing 15%, and clearly not all of sewage treatment works releases are associated with residential end uses. So at best, it's dealing with about 15% of the input. Something that I'm very, very passionate about, brownfield land is clearly being disadvantaged. Also, do we really want to be losing our agricultural land? And do we want to be taking primary agricultural land out of production? It may be appropriate for some types of agricultural land, but we really don't want to be increasing our dependence on overseas sources of food, particularly of what's been going on in 2020. We really don't want to be reducing our agricultural output, ideally. And then what about other planning applications? So there's one that I've been dealing with in the Solent area, which is about an industrial land use. It doesn't need an environmental permit, but it will be discharging various industrial effluents, which may well include nutrients. And so how is that being tackled within this current framework? So as I say, what about farming? And also, what about other Natura 2000 sites elsewhere? I'll come on to that in that very specifically, there's been a focus on one or two Natura 2000 sites. So looking at that on a wider basis, on the left, you can see a plan of some of our Natura 2000 sites, but the ones that are highlighted are those that are receiving excess nutrient inputs from one source or another. So in effect, you've got aquatic sources in the various pink and blue colors, so our rivers, our estuaries, and our lakes. And then the red outlines are simply atmospheric nitrogen emissions where the critical loading is being exceeded on an annual basis, and that is covering a lot of our wider habitats, including upland areas and other estuaries and so forth. So we have a lot of sites that are in a potentially eutrophic condition. These are the ones in the watercourses are receiving in excess of the nitrate or phosphate limits. It doesn't necessarily mean it is actually eutrophic. Like I say, you need other lines of biological and ecological evidence, but there's certainly that possibility. Now, every Natura 2000 site has had a site improvement plan produced by Natural England in about 2014, 2015 from memory. 8 of those have specific nutrient management plans within them, so clearly where they've been identified as a threat. And there's one more in production, which I'll come on to on the next slide. These are in various stages of production. One of them, as you'll see, is obviously failing at the moment. Interestingly, Solent Maritime does not have a nutrient management plan specifically in the site improvement plan. So there's lots of additional Natura 2000 sites where nutrients are a threat, and that was highlighted in the site improvement plan, but it didn't have its own specific NMP. So if you're looking at where additional sites may be a problem in the future, don't just solely look at the sites that actually have nutrient management plans. So None of these nutrient management plans affect atmospheric deposition sites. Natural England is running a really good pilot trial of these site nitrogen action plans, SNAPs. They're a really good idea if you see what they're trying to do on about half a dozen schemes from memory, but they're in fairly early days. They recommended them in about 2015, and they're still in kind of fairly early days. If that can be widened out, that would be fantastic, because they're trying to identify where this nitrogen is coming from, and clearly that is essential before you can then develop a useful strategy to mitigate those impacts and to try and get these sites into a favourable status. So the sites have got nutrient management plans. I'll just go into a few of these. The River Wye and Lug, basically, I'll talk about that in more detail, but it appears to be failing. The River Lug had a specific nutrient management plan, which is now basically on hold. This is all to do with phosphate releases into freshwater, but it looks like wider parts of that drainage basin are now having problems, and so they're going to have to address the wider drainage basin by the looks of things. There are some others that appear to be working fairly effectively, such as the Avon, Hampshire area. The River Mease is a particularly good one. That, touch wood, I can't see any evidence that this one's been called into doubt yet, but I may be corrected by somebody from Natural England. But it requires a payment for development via a Section 106 agreement to deal with phosphate reduction, and that is contributing to things like silt traps in the floodplain and also floodplain management itself, because if the silt can be captured, then the phosphate can be captured within that and removed from the river system. There's others that you can see that are under development that don't have specific targets yet, and so it's unclear as to whether there's going to be development constraints in the future. And the river racks, the strategy I think is just being written at the moment, so that's one that's being added to, and that's the river racks down in Devon from memory. So some examples of some specific planning impacts to date. So whilst some councils are in full kind of moratorium, there have still been some planning permissions that have gone through, and some applications that have used the Natural England nutrient calculator. So the first one was actually looking into it quite straightforward. Wellbourne Garden Village in Fareham Council. So it's for 6,000 dwellings, but they're taking 280 hectares of arable land out of production. So there's a huge saving in nutrient losses there, and also the development itself is incorporating 80 hectares of green space, and the development on average it's only 16 homes per hectare. So on something of this scale, it's fairly easy to demonstrate actually that they will be removing nitrogen from the environment rather than adding to the burden on the sewage network. However, I would just make one minor point that whilst Natural England agreed with the calculations that were done, wider sources of nitrogen were not taken into account. This scheme includes a large motorway upgrade of a junction, I believe, and obviously there's going to be a lot of traffic involved. So things that would need to be considered in the Netherlands are not being required to be considered at the moment in the UK, not to deal with the habitats regulations. So Portsmouth City Council, Portsmouth has taken a very interesting and I would say proactive approach to trying to deal with the problem. They've been trying very hard to get development activity going again. And there's one particularly well-known case, I think, the former Drayton Dairy, where the applicant submitted their nutrient calculations. Natural England rejected this one, said you need to go away and do it again, because the applicant had claimed effectively the credits for ceasing dairy farming when actually that dairy farm had not been in use for 10 years and it had been demolished for a long time. So they were not allowed to claim those credits. Instead, they had to effectively buy into Portsmouth City Council's nutrient mitigation strategy. So Portsmouth Council have generated kind of headroom in their planning system by two measures, one of which they still keep control of their council housing stock, which I know is fairly unusual, but they are making various water saving measures within the council housing stock and claiming the nutrient credits for that. They have also identified further credits by basically holding back their own development programs of their own assets. So those two are providing headroom, and they've allowed some developments to proceed, and you can see there's costs that have been quoted on a major development of just over £4,000 per dwelling. There has been some wider criticism and commentary that as to whether this is actually defensible in the long term. I won't really say any more than that, just to say that you know, on the one side they're being very proactive and doing all they can, on the other some of how they've gone about it could be called into question, but it's certainly an interesting model to go and have a look at. Then a third one where actually this has been refused was another one where the applicant did the calculation on nutrients, and it was actually approved by Natural England, but when the application was scrutinised by the planners, they realised that these agricultural uses had not been in effect in operation for a long period of time on site, or certainly for a large proportion of the site, so they couldn't claim all of those credits. And secondly, they were also looking to offset some of the balance off-site, but they could not demonstrate that the change of agricultural land use to woodland could be guaranteed or locked in legally. So on two fronts, that was rejected, and that was another site in Fareham. So a nice kind of simpler example is the River Mease. This one's been running since about 2011, 2012 from memory, and it requires contributions to floodplain management and dealing with silt traps and simple things like that. And the contributions required per home actually are a lot less. So that's maybe a reason why it's not hit the headlines to quite such a great degree. The River Mease runs through central England, around Leicestershire, and basically in terms of the order of contribution, it's effectively hundreds of pounds rather than thousands. So it's no doubt painful for a developer, but is not maybe bringing the development into question in terms of viability. So something that came up this weekend, so I had to revise this on Saturday because the Guardian raised this, and I just thought it was too interesting and too relevant to miss out. But so the original nutrient management plan was really relating to the River Lug, because the Lug was seen to be providing historical inputs really of phosphate that was affecting both the upper reaches, or sorry, the lower reaches of the Lug and downstream in the River Wye. And that plan shows that where the eutrophication was taking place pre-2010, but since 2010 it has extended much further upstream up the River Wye and is clearly not related to the River Lug itself. And they've recognised, particularly around the Eithon in Wales, is cause of a lot of the problems. Now this is very new, so some of this might be challenged by some of the regulators, but certainly what appears to be the case is that a lot of permissions have been granted for chicken farms up in the hills, and a lot of that runoff is causing issues. So believe it or not, apparently since 2008, 10 million additional chickens have been granted permission to be farmed in this area. And so since 2019, just in 2019, 20 applications were approved, and apparently there's at least another 11 under current review. Now I've had a quick look and reviewed a sample of a habitats regulations assessment that's been done for some of these, and just this one example I'll show you from my perspective is clearly inadequate and really not doing the job. So this is one for a permit to an existing operation, but was to allow for an awful lot more birds. And the NRW permit declaration, so this was to do with the permit, not the planning permission itself, but the permit that went with it. And the NRW made these statements within their justification. So the River Wye was screened out due to the aquatic and non-vulnerable condition of elements of the SAC that lie within the 10-kilometre from the proposed expanded installation. Which that just begs the question, well, what on earth happens after you go 10 kilometres downstream? There's a very specific requirement to consider downstream impact. So I've no idea why an arbitrary 10-kilometre limit was stated and what is expected to happen to those nutrients when they go beyond the 10 kilometres limit. Another statement about airborne emissions of ammonia, and this is the one that's really caught out in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, they were not properly accounting for these airborne emissions, and was the main reason why those farming permits were thrown out in 2018. And just this statement saying that basically they're going to be emitted to the river. There cannot be possibly any deposition because it's washed away by the river itself and cannot accumulate to cause adverse effects, which just leads to the question, well, what on earth is going on in the river itself? So yeah, it's frankly astonishing. And then finally, manure storage and spreading does not take place in the installation boundary. Now, it may be fair enough that within the specific red line permit boundary, they do not need to consider the spreading of the chicken manure, but certainly that would be required within the planning application itself. So somewhere that is falling between two stools and not being taken into account. And this is just one of those farms, and it looks like there's many dozens of these that have been permitted and is causing an issue. So I'll just move on to some conclusions on our UK implementation. I'm sorry if this is kind of real fast overview, but it is a very broad topic. So generally, as a starting point, this is a very important subject for the likes of Natural England. They do have to try and deal with it in the best way possible, because too many of our sites are not achieving a good status, and we're not making sufficient progress towards getting these to good status. So the current actions that are being taken that might be very kind of narrow focus and limited, well, they can be justified in terms of the Dutch cases. That it is justified, because any form of release where these receptors are in unfavorable condition need to be tackled. But some of the wider causes that were the result of those Dutch legal cases are not visibly being tackled. Like I say, behind the scenes, no doubt there is stuff going on. So there's much more action needed to address other sources of nutrient pollution, and large parts of the wider nitrogen cycle are not really being tackled yet. Ammonia releases in particular, they are very difficult and they're not being tackled effectively. The main focus to date has actually been on human health quality and the effect of breathing it in, as well as the climate change impact. Emissions to land from NH3 has not really been addressed terribly well so far. The legislation is siloed, and also you speak to any consultants, you know, we're the same as anywhere else. You'll have various specific experts, whether they're ecologists, air quality specialists, hydrologists. They'll be on either sides of regulators, local authorities. They're all siloed and they're not particularly well joined up. There's not very much good holistic legislation out there. Some of the good holistic stuff that's come out recently is to actually tackle farming and to work with farmers and agricultural practices. There's some really good stuff coming out, but it's a start, is what I would suggest. So certainly people like Natural England, by the looks of things, and the Environment Agency, to do some of the various inspections that are required, need more resources, both to work on the science, on the monitoring, and then actually enforcement of the legislation as it appears. But the Environment Agency are very, very open. What I've put in bold there, they're clearly stating this is in a document about managing nitrates in England, and they acknowledge that the tools that they have to deal with this problem are not sufficient, and that a policy review is needed. And similarly on air impacts, that there's been very limited success to date in dealing with eutrophication. So yeah, like I say, I don't want to be critical. I'm not being critical of any particular agencies. There's a lot of work going on in the background, and what I can see clearly is that, first of all, the science is very difficult to join this all up, and secondly, the regulators are very stretched. So I really don't intend to be too critical. In terms of driving projects forward, certainly ourselves from a consultancy point of view, I think it's very important to adopt a fairly common and well-known concept of a source pathway receptor concept. We just need to be aware of how regional this might be at times for our Natura 2000 sites. So we've got to be identifying our potential sources of nutrient release within all phases. So whether that's waterborne, whether it's airborne, etc. And then identify our Natura 2000 sites as best as possible that may potentially be impacted. And then when we've identified one or more of these sites, really do consult Natural England to understand what data do they have on it, what do they see as the current threats, and what are they looking to do in terms of implementing improvement strategies. So try and find out what the current knowledge of that site is. And then we can consider the potential pathways to that receptor. And if present or even possible, as the legislation states, we will need to undertake habitats regulations assessment. So if then that the receptor is both already impacted by nutrients and our proposed development or plan is going to add to that loading, then we'll need to undertake that appropriate assessment, and we'll need potentially to demonstrate nutrient neutrality. So if the natural language calculator is appropriate, use that, but there may be other ways of trying to assess that nutrient balance. So if the outcome is that you are putting too many nutrients into that receptor, then one obvious approach is you simply have to reject or amend that particular proposal. Otherwise, you're then going down to the various mitigation strategies, whether that's on-site or off-site or a combination. And just be aware, because of some of the regional scale of some of these issues, this type of screening exercise on a project or plan may not be a typical part of a consultant's due diligence exercise. So make sure if you are engaging with consultants that you discuss the brief and the scope very clearly. So in terms of future work going on, there's the partnership with South Hampshire who are looking at a regional offset strategy, but that may be a while off. It'd be very interesting to see what happens with the first offsetting schemes, particularly if anybody's buying into that farm purchase scheme in the Isle of Wight. Look out for all regulatory announcements, whether it's on specific planning responses. It's very interesting to see when people use the natural linear calculator, what the regulatory responses are. Keep an eye on the River Wye to see what's happening there. See if there's any action to deal with some of the impact on the terrestrial habitats, which isn't currently really happening. And keep an eye on those nutrient management plans, see if they are developed and if they start to incorporate development-specific constraints. There are numerous potential legal challenges to the current UK approach, albeit Brexit should not be ignored. So the requirement for good status has been dropped in its very specific timescale. The government is producing its 25-year plan, which has possibilities, but it will not have that specific goal in there. The ECJ will also lose jurisdiction, probably, over the habitats regulations within the UK. So what is going to happen? What actually is that hierarchy for appeals in the future? We do not know. And there's work that continues on the agricultural sector. There's some very good stuff in the agricultural sector that's going on. More of it needs to be made mandatory. If anybody's seen in the news, just out of interest, Wales as a whole country, there's a current proposal from the Welsh Assembly to make the entire country a nitrate vulnerable zone, which hasn't gone down terribly well with the Welsh farmers. So just in conclusion, be aware of the location and condition of your Natura 2000 sites, and especially those in unfavourable status, you may well need to demonstrate nutrient neutrality. So early consultation with Natural England or other stakeholders is really important. So the HRA may well need to be regional in scale to pick up all these potential impacts. Legislation, clearly by the looks of things, needs work to make it more holistic. The 25-year environment plan is certainly an opportunity to do that. Be interesting to see if nutrient trading develops, a bit like carbon trading has developed, or actually maybe a better solution might be for local authorities to identify these nutrient savings that are made on various activities they undertake and permit, and then provide a pot, in effect, to then try and progress the more favourable, the more sustainable developments in brownfield areas or social housing, urban areas, etc., and try and drive it that way. And clearly this is rapidly evolving. The policy is changing, the technical guidance is changing, and Brexit is happening. So if I do this presentation in a year's time, it could be quite different. So apologies for some of that. Feels like a bit of a rush through of the topic, but hopefully that's covered everything in a little bit of detail anyway. So thank you very much. And I don't know if there's any questions following on from any of that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. It's such a broad-ranging topic that I think we needed to just let it run, essentially. So we've got a few questions, and I think we might be able to answer a couple, but as discussed before, we'll send a questions and answers list out to everyone so that they can see what was responded, and we can have a bit more of a think about it before we respond.
Yeah.
So the first one that I want you to answer is one from Sue Bellamy from Dorset Council and Melanie Robertson from Southampton, who both had a very similar question. Okay. Thank you, great presentation. It's always pleasing to hear. Can you explain why water efficiency measures reduces nutrients rather than just making them more concentrated in smaller quantities of water? Is this down to how the wastewater treatment work process the wastewater? And that was the same for both.
That's a very good question. I am not a water industry expert. I would say part of the question would be some of these measures that are taking place in terms of water efficiency will stop the nutrients getting into the environment in the first place. So certain SUDS activities, for example, if you're reducing what is going into the effluent pipes, will effectively do some natural treatments up front. So whether it is kind of producing as sediment which is collected, or allowing natural processes to take place. Nitrogen, you know, if you've got nitrate, if you can provide it enough time in aerobic conditions, you can drive what's called denitrification, which will knock out the oxygen, and you end up with N2, which is just nitrogen gas. So you can drive processes which will just allow nitrogen to be released to the atmosphere, and your problem has gone before it's released to effluent. But others, yeah, it's complicated. It may be, if you're slowing it down, reducing what's going to the treatment works in terms of overall volume, then the treatment works may be able to take out more of that nitrogen. So sorry, that's not a complete answer, but it's best I can manage.
No, that's great. I'm sure we can have another think with our team and get a more.
We do have a water team that I can consult with internally, yeah. So I can try and do
one other one. I mean, I don't know if the webinar is actually going to let us. I think it will let us overrun slightly, so I'll still be able to do the formal RTPI housekeeping at the end. So I think we probably get through these questions, to be honest. So one from Grace Booth at Isle of Wight. The legal interpretation of the Dutch case means that in England, development projects must be screened through HRA, and cumulative impacts from sewage waste is considered an impact. However, wastewater treatment works are permitted and licensable, and therefore already been through HRA.
Yeah.
Is this not meaning the same projects are assessed twice?
There is the issue of double counting of some of this, but the wastewater treatment plants, they are quite separate in how they are set up. I mean, in some ways, they're a contradiction with the HRA, because you are, let's say that downstream of a particular treatment plant, there is a receptor that's not in a good status, then in theory, legally, they shouldn't be allowed to release any nutrients to the environment. So clearly there's already that taken into account. But I think when you look at the assessments, it's taken into account that I think a good example is actually the Poole Harbour nutrients management plan, where effectively it assumes that the water treatment plant is going to take out 75% of the nutrients that's released, so that's taken into account. And for your nitrate neutrality, you have to deal with the additional 25% and make sure that that is neutral. So that's certainly worth a look to see how that's being calculated, to make sure they're not doing that form of double counting. But you'll see the calculation, and within the natural linear calculator, they're assuming that that treatment plant is already taking out a proportion of that effluent loading. Part of the natural linear calculator allows you to select a particular treatment works that will take out a proportion. If you say don't know or unknown, it won't take any out, and so that's part of their calculation. So in answer, I don't think it is double counting unless you say unknown on the natural linear calculator, and then in which case you will have that double counting effect. So there's the natural linear calculator, like I say, have a look at, and you can choose your treatment farm, and it will take out certain amounts of nutrients which presumably are dealt with within the original treatment works application.
Great, thanks, Rich. And one last one from Richard Koska, RCC Town Planning. He's currently working on a new building on a farm that will accommodate an extra 400 pigs, and a result of the nutrient neutrality report is requiring around 8 hectares of current arable farmland to be removed from the production. Obviously, it's a very difficult situation. I think it's more of a point, and I mean, he does question the sustainability of that and whether it's going to really penalise farmers in the long term, and they're going to bear most of the burden from this type of project. That's part one. If you've got any comment, and then there's an extra portion which I feel I might have to.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I think the two forms of farming that have the highest impact are pig farming and poultry farming. They're the high intensity and the types of releases. And I'd be interested to see that assessment, to see whether that took into account the atmospheric emissions as well. I'd be very interested to see if that was that 360-degree assessment of the nitrogen releases, or just looking at the effluent releases and the runoff to watercourses. Yes, I think it's fair to say that there's very significant impact on agriculture, and it's really important. We've got to support our farmers. A lot of farmers run on a very that do not make much profit, and it's very hard to invest in improving the environmental measures. Like I say, there are some very good agricultural measures in place, which, if implemented, are not necessarily terrible. It depends on the setting of the farm and what can be done. But effectively, you've got to make sure you're not spreading manure at the wrong time of year. If you can mix it in to prevent atmospheric emissions, that's very important. Don't do it in periods of bad weather. Got to make sure you know where all your surface watercourses or ditches are, and you're not allowed to release within about 10 meters of those sources. There's some things that could actually be farmers' benefits that they've never historically done. They should be regularly testing their soils to see if they actually need any form of improvement and enhancement. They should be doing that a minimum every 5 years. And if this is being done, and hopefully they're preventing losses, then they can demonstrate improvement. So can they incorporate management strips in fields like 5 or 10 meter buffers, where they say plant trees along the sides of brooks, etc., that can try and intercept some of these releases? And then on a larger scale, now this is more difficult, but there's this idealized scenario that seems like some kind of nirvana, but basically agricultural farms growing crops need these nutrients, and livestock farms produce in excess of them. Often they're in different parts of the country, so transporting them from one to the other is difficult, and they're not in the right form that's easy to apply to the fields for the crops. But in theory, you could balance them up, transporting one between the other, so they could take their excess manure off to a farmer that needs those nutrients and try and provide a balance that way. That is very difficult to deal with in any kind of planning application and any particular HRA, but you can see there are wider things that are being looked at to try and enforce it. But yeah, I do sympathise it's difficult. They're also dealing with legacy sites. This farm has probably been there for hundreds of years. They might have old slurry pits and so forth that are a legacy, that are gradually releasing nutrients to the ground. And how do you invest in that overnight? It is very tricky. I can see why Natural England have dealt with some of what they might think of kind of the easier planning related routes straight away, rather than going after the agricultural sector, because it is hard to solve. Sorry if that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but it is a real difficult area.
It is, and I don't think it's going to end here, and there's not going to be a simple answer to this either. Richard does go on to ask about whether reserve matters applications are caught in this type of assessment if the outline was granted prior to the new rules coming in. Now, I think first of all, it's key to understand where the difficulty comes in from the HRA side. Particularly between what is a project and what is a plan. The first element is the HRA's term for project is very different to ours, and we may consider it as a development. But as we know, some elements are permitted developments, such as agricultural uses. They can be permitted, but it doesn't stop it from being development. And actually, that might be caught within this HRA process as well. Now, that might come in as part of EIA, as we know, most on the call, that if something is EIA, then it's automatically not permitted development anymore. But also, the local plans and development plans for an area are also classed as a plan, which are essentially those outline type allocations that can provide rules around how you should develop something. So outlines, development plan allocations, they could all be classed as a plan in accordance with the legal cases that have taken place in the EU. But critically, with outline, the question will be, was it a thing that needed to be considered as part of the outline, or is it part of the detailed considerations of that reserve matters application? Now, one could argue that if you got an outline application for 100 houses, for example, then that would be, you know, that would already be committed, and that should have already been taken account of at that outline stage. Whereas if it is another, maybe an industrial type development, where the detail of how foul waste is going to be disposed of, any other types of process waste is going to be disposed of, and perhaps that could be reasonably considered as a detailed consideration, and the local authority or regulators could be asking for more input at that stage. And so yeah, it's a bit difficult, because you can essentially, these challenges have been challenges to regional plans, national plans, and also down to the local level. So that's what's been causing the biggest issue in the Netherlands, because they've been basically putting on projects on hold that have essentially already been granted some form of permission or outline permission, because in the Netherlands, I think they operate like a zoning structure, which is essentially that outline method that we have in the UK. So that's what they've seen, and hopefully we can find other ways around it and innovative developments which kind of resolve these issues, but it is very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, just I guess that's a fairly narrow legal planning question as to whether that's already been considered at outline stage and therefore it's done and dusted. The other thing to bear in mind and maybe ask the question is, are the planning officers, the planning team involved, going to be worried about a challenge? Are they worried about judicial review down the line, which is what's driven a lot of the behaviour in the Solent region, that genuine justified concern? So.
Yeah, and I think that's it for the questions. I think we had a total of around 120 people on the call at the peak period, and so very thank you for attending. And we did actually get through all the questions, so I can leave that piece of housekeeping to one side. But we will again send out the questions and answers to everyone, and of course we'll also send out Richard and my details, so that if you wanted to get in touch or ask anything specifically, I mean, we've gone through quite a bit of research, so we're more than happy to share it. So please fill in the online event survey, which will automatically load after the webinar ends, which it does end quite quickly. It will only take about 2 minutes, but it's very useful for us to make sure that we can tailor these types of events, you know, more, and whether or not this subject area is something you want to hear more of, or certainly you want this type of consultant perspective as more of a a feature going forward. And the next event is Land Value Capture as part of the Planner Live Week, which runs 29th of June to the 3rd of July. And if you check online under RTPI Events, RTPI Online, and a link will be sent to you for that as well. But thank you very much, and thanks again from Richard, because he's put quite a bit of time into this, and I think it's it's a very interesting subject. And I know that I've certainly seen a couple of Netflix programs and such which covers a little bit of this type of thing, and it's nice to just get an overview of facts rather than I guess politically versioned elements of the talk. So thanks again to all, and hopefully see you soon.